Hi, I'm Robert Horton. I'm a member of the National Society of Film Critics and a board member at Scarecrow Video. And I'm leading our Scarecrow Academy semester called The Art in Horror, Horror and the Director, in which we examine the horror movie through the specific lens of what the art of directing is. And I'm going to give a little introduction to our next session, which will be Saturday, September 12th at 2 p.m. Pacific Time. You can join us via Zoom, and we will convene. You can find a link on this page at the Scarecrow website to find out how to register for the film and how to watch the film before we get together. The movie in question, Night of the Living Dead, directed by George Romero. We began our online sessions with films by Alfred Hitchcock and Roman Polanski, two directors who come out of a classical tradition, albeit from different generations. And in some ways, it's hard to believe that Night of the Living Dead came out the same year as Rosemary's Baby, 1968, because the two films are so very different in their style and approach. They're both landmark horror films, but Polanski made his film in the last vestiges of the Hollywood studio system. It's a very elegantly made film, has top production values, movie stars even. And yet is a great unsettling horror film. Night of the Living Dead, on the other hand, is an independent production shot in Pittsburgh at a very bargain basement level. The film seems to not only want to create terror, but in some ways to overturn certain traditions of the horror movie itself. It's a very visceral film in the literal sense of that word at times. It's still upsetting, and I think it still speaks to us directly. We are going to be concentrating on directing arts, so I'll introduce a couple of ideas about the style of George Romero, which is very forceful and innovative despite the constraints of a low budget, and probably we'll talk a little bit about how working within the constraints of a low budget can lead to some important effects and even an overt sense of fear. Night of the Living Dead stands at a crossroads in the horror movie and maybe at American cinema in general. On the one hand, it's a little like a Howard Hawks film, and we watched a Hawks movie in this series already, The Thing from Another World, when we were still convening at Scarecrow, because it's a scenario about a small group of people trapped in a confined space, and they have to figure out a solution to a problem by the end of the film. But Night of the Living Dead is a part of a modern wave of movie making because it suggests in some ways that the problem ultimately may not be solvable. And the treatment of the problem in the Romero film is accompanied by a certain kind of self-consciousness about what we're seeing. Particularly, the movie tips its hand in the opening sequence, a very famous sequence set in a graveyard. People are walking around, and the conventions of the horror movie are brought up as one of the characters starts talking in an obviously Boris Karloff voice, and he's teasing his sister and joking about the weird-looking man who's staggering around over there in the one corner of the graveyard, and only to find out that the joke is all too real. And the movie knows that the audience is already hip to certain kinds of cliches of the horror movie. They're in on this joke, and so it disarms us with that, but then it doubles down on the horror that immediately follows. So in that sense, the opening scene of Night of the Living Dead seems to predict this kind of self-referential movies in, let's say, the Scream franchise by a few decades. Night of the Living Dead also does that interesting that certain movies, and particularly genre movies, sometimes can do. It can give us a snapshot of its era. If you want to look back and try to find something out about the late 60s by looking at films from that era, you can look at officially sanctioned movies like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner or Night of the Living, or In the Heat of the Night, for instance, and try to study it from that angle. But I think a sort of raw piece of pulp fiction like Night of the Living Dead almost seems like it's speaking directly out of the collective subconscious of that era, as though it's not only about something awful, but seems to be embodying some of the unrest of, in this case, the late 60s, but filtered through the conventions of the horror genre. Now, those conventions include the subgenre of the zombie picture, even though nobody ever uses the word zombie in this film. This is a movie that spawned countless imitators, including a number of films that Romero continued to make throughout the rest of his career. It used the idea of zombies that have to stagger around when they walk, and cannibalism amongst zombies, and needing to shoot a zombie in the head to finally dispatch them and so on. It's quite a far cry from, let's say, a film like I Walked with a Zombie, which is another movie that we watched earlier in our Scarecrow Academy session. We'll look at a little bit of the political subtexts that you might find in this film, or the political texts for that matter. The fact that George Romero cast a black actor, Dwayne Jones, in the lead role, in a part that had not been written specifically for race. Jones just happened to be the best actor that they found. Altered certain aspects of the way they shot the film after that, and creates a kind of interesting tension in the movie that, again, makes the movie about race, even when it hadn't explicitly been intended to be that way from the beginning of its conception. All of this comes in the form of a very suspenseful horror movie that pointed the way toward a different kind of horror film that was going to come in the 70s. Night of the Living Dead was one of those movies that unlocked that wave that came along, whether it was a studio-made film like The Exorcist or an independent movie like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The 70s horror movies would repeatedly violate a kind of presumed contract between movie and audience, and made it clear that the center no longer held, certainly not in the horror film. Now, that's a lot for a low-budget production from Pittsburgh to live up to, but when we gather, we will explore how Night of the Living Dead rises, so to speak, to the occasion. So I hope you'll join us on September 12th for another edition of The Art in Horror.